It's the week ending Friday the 16th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ukraine advancing further into Russia following their surprise incursion into Kursk, Western leaders calling for restraint from Iran amidst further tensions in the Middle East, and over 80% of students getting into their first-choice university after receiving their A-level results. And if that's you, congratulations. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Rebecca Messina, plus we welcome back BBC Sport journalist Emma Smith, and making his debut on the show, the deputy editor of money-saving expert Gary Caffell. Hi, Gary.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Is it Caffell or is it Caffell?
It's Caffell, and I've been called a lot worse.
Caffell. See, now you've said it, and I'm going to write it down phonetically. That's going to be a burden that I always have to get right. Now, tradition dictates that as it is your first time on the show, before we proceed with any other business, you must now declare to us all a fact about yourself we could not have discovered merely by Googling you.
Well, my claim to fame is I once held a world juggling record.
That is amazing. When did you learn juggling? How old were you?
It was about 30 years ago, so I was fairly young at the time. And it was the most people juggling at one time. It was at Wembley Stadium, the most people juggling at one point. And I managed to keep the balls in the air for, I think, the full 30 seconds or a minute, whatever it was. I often wonder if it's still standing. I suspect it's probably not. But, I was a world record holder at one point.
Hold on. So you were a kid, you were in a group, you were at Wembley Stadium. Are you playing this down, and were you on Record Breakers with Roy Castle and Cheryl Baker?
Absolutely, they were there, and I did feature in a passing clip on the show as well. So absolutely, yes, it was amazing times.
Fantastic. Couldn't have kept Baker out of that if you tried. Okay, Rebecca, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, this is the week we saw an anniversary, but one most of us would be happy to forget.
This is a big honor for Afghanistan. 3 years ago on this date, Afghanistan was liberated. This is Freedom Day, and the people will celebrate this day.
Afghanistan's head of state television, Nazar Mohammed Zahed, speaking to France 24 from Helmand province on Wednesday. Rebecca, why? What's the story?
Well, the story is that it's been 3 years since the Taliban regained control over Afghanistan, and this was marked with a large military parade at the airbase at Bagram, which may seem familiar. And if it's familiar, it's because that was where the US had their main airbase during the occupation of Afghanistan. And actually, it was a place where Taliban prisoners were once held during that period as well. But this parade featured armoured vehicles, including some that were captured from the US-backed former government from the Afghan Republic, as well as Soviet-era tanks, all of them flying the black and white flag of Taliban Afghanistan.
And the symbolism of that, obviously, baked in, isn't it? That they're doing it, as you say, from where the US used to be, that they're displaying all their military equipment. Did you get the sense, though, Rebecca, that accurately reflects what life is like there at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing is that a lot of people within Afghanistan are just not happy, but relieved at least to have something resembling a little bit of peace and stability in a country that had been plagued by pretty much near constant unrest and violence for the best part of 40 years. I mean, we can probably get into it later, but Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are still huge threats. There's still a lot of terrorist activity within the country, but certainly to the average person, it may seem like things are at least a little bit calmer, if of course not freer or more prosperous or really any easier than they were in the past, but at least less outwardly violent. And one of the reasons I think that the Taliban has pushed so hard for this anniversary to be recognized and celebrated is that basically the Taliban in a lot of ways isn't really a government. It's a fighting organization that has taken power. There aren't any elections. A lot of the bureaucrats and technocrats within the government are people who had those jobs under the previous regime, because the Taliban leaders recognize that they don't have the expertise to exercise the functions of government. Essentially, it's a largely rural, largely uneducated class of fighting men that makes up the bulk of the organization. So it's a very unusual situation for a country to be in. And events like this really help to underscore to the public at large that the Taliban is in charge, even though nobody has chosen to put them there.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Emma, I sort of like the thrust of Rebecca's argument here. Afghanistan's doing better than you might think, and let's talk about what the Taliban have done. Obviously, we need to play lip service at this point to the appalling situation there for women and girls in particular.
Absolutely. As is the most well-known thing about Afghanistan, under the Taliban, women and girls have essentially no rights, no right to education. But I suppose that one of the reasons why the Taliban have been secure as the government of Afghanistan for the last 3 years is because they are united on issues like this. They're united on cultural issues like women's rights or lack thereof. And it's allowed them to hold a stable place in government, even if that government has policies which are repellent to a lot of people outside of Afghanistan and within it too.
And what about economically, Gary? What is the economic picture in Afghanistan these days?
Well, I mean, according to the World Bank, 90% of the population are stuck in poverty. So, not great is the answer to that. In 2023, foreign aid still made up around 30% of the country's GDP. So, that is a lot of that aid is coming from the United States still. Whether that cash is going to where it needs it most is up for debate. But there is still a lot of incoming support for the organisation. When we look at what the Taliban can actually do, it's a bit of a strange one really, because they're quite big on taxation, but cash is printed abroad. Interest transactions are banned because you can't pay interest under Islam. Banks aren't lending. They can't borrow money because they're not recognised as the government. And international banking is cut off. So essentially they're sort of stuck in this bit of a vicious circle until they can improve relationships around the world.
But they're not cut off by everybody, are they, Rebecca? Who recognises them?
Well, representatives of the Taliban have been invited to visit Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, basically all the usual suspects.
All the fun haunts.
Yeah, and it's not just a case of, my enemy's enemy is my friend. It's also that Afghanistan's location, obviously, it's surrounded by these giant powers. And the last thing they want is the country spiraling into civil war or for terror groups to take a larger hold than they have, because that's going to spell trouble for them as well. So it's, very much a strategic move on the part of countries like China and Russia, rather than particularly having any sympathy with the Taliban as a government. It's really about keeping their own borders secure.
How long do you think it might be, Emma, though, before other countries start to recognise the Afghanistan under the Taliban?
I think that obviously it'll never be recognised by certain countries, the USA for one, but I think in terms of the neighbours of Afghanistan, the direct neighbours, I think that there's certainly a great amount of stock and relief in having a stable and at least an Afghanistan that isn't amidst war as it had been for the 3 decades before the Taliban took over. It's something that Afghanistan's neighbours don't have to be quite so constantly aware of. And, the Taliban does have these links with China and Russia, which are permanent members of the UN Security Council. So they do have a certain amount of, sympathetic ear at the top level of international politics. So I think that there is definitely an element within the countries that are around Afghanistan will be happy with a stable Afghanistan, even if those in charge are not necessarily those that they would prefer to be there.
And they have seen some success, Gary, in curbing opium production, which was something that the Brits and the Americans really struggled with.
Absolutely. This has had a significant impact, actually. I think what they did was they took a gradual approach. So they said, if your crops, so got a bumper crop ready to be harvested, they ignored that for now, but they increased it over time, got tighter on the restrictions over time. And actually the success of that, in 2021, Afghanistan's drug economy was worth 14% of the country's GDP, but they've now suppressed opium poppy cultivation by almost 90%, according to a lot of reports out there. So, cracking down on drugs has got to be a positive, and they've done really well with that. The flip side of that is, those farmers are really now struggling to make a living.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, Rebecca, that, like, unfortunately, the curbing of women's rights to such an oppressive degree comes from their very extreme interpretation of Sharia law, doesn't it? It's very clear that you shouldn't be taking drugs in Islam, and I wonder actually if you see both sides of that coming out in those two policies. Women basically can't leave the house unaccompanied, but on the other hand, they're not exporting heroin anymore.
Yeah, and actually those two things, the opium production crackdown and the crackdown on women's rights, both have really significant impacts on the economy. As Gary alluded to, the farmers who relied on that previously and now obviously have no choice but to pivot to other things. But that is not simple. One of the really big advantages of poppies is that they are really hardy. Opium poppies are very hardy, and they can grow really well in Afghanistan's climate, which is hot and dry. The land is very salty. It's definitely not the kind of place that's welcome to all variety of crops. And climate change has hit Afghanistan much harder than other parts of the world. Global warming is occurring there at twice the rate seen on the global average. So it really is a huge problem. And one one that, to be honest, Taliban government spokesmen have come forward and have, like, they've publicly admitted that this is a huge problem and they are trying to work out how to solve it. They're trying to work out what crops could grow in the land. Wheat is the kind of go-to alternative, but that has been failing. The temperatures are just too hot and dry. There is not enough water. Droughts are becoming more and more commonplace. And obviously, if everyone pivots to wheat, the price of wheat goes down. People can't survive on that. They're talking about trying pistachios, saffron. There are certain crops that aren't native to Afghanistan that could be introduced to alleviate that. And then the near elimination of women.
There is a global depression in pistachios, I happen to know, because I was watching an interview with someone who made ice creams the other day. And they were talking about inflation in the UK being partly because of the price of pistachios.
Well, pistachios are like the new salty caramel. Have you noticed this? So, there's definitely a huge demand for it. But, obviously that would be a huge project to try and pivot towards. And also, like, the near elimination of women from the workforce. We've talked about it in terms of the effect it has on women's rights. But also, that's 50% of the population who aren't paying tax, who aren't earning, who aren't spending. Unemployment in Afghanistan is sky high. And you might think, well, at least there's more jobs for men without the women in the workplace. But it doesn't always work like that. The Taliban ordered, for instance, the closure of all hairdressers and beauty salons. That doesn't provide jobs for anyone. It doesn't provide jobs for any men. It just shuts down another economic sector. So you can see where, like, these religiously influenced rules then have this very, like, devastating real world impact on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, no one really believed it, Emma, 3 years ago. But 3 years ago, they did say, the Taliban, didn't they? Oh, we're different now. We're not your 9/11 Taliban. We're a different Taliban now. And there's, women definitely will be in education, and we definitely will have jobs for women. And it was just all complete lie.
Yes, basically. I suppose saying we're not the Taliban of 9/11, the only difference seems to be that they're not, actively pursuing terrorist acts outside of Afghanistan. We've talked a lot about sort of the Taliban being secure in government, and but that's only true to a certain amount of extent. I mean, this is a country that, as of 2023, 30% of its GDP remains foreign aid. It's a state and a government which is secure, seemingly in name only. I mean, and it's, as has been mentioned, it's a state where half the workforce are not allowed to work, and then even fewer of that workforce are there now because they managed to flee to Pakistan and other countries around the world. And it's not necessarily a government which is functioning, in a democratic and, way that's riven with corruption. I was reading a really useful piece in the Washington Post, which was talking about how the Taliban are governing over the last 3 years, and basically it's jobs for the boys. Basically, several top Taliban members have been given top government jobs, perks like extra wives, houses, cars, while the civil servants, in Afghanistan get on with actually trying to run the country in a climate of fear, make sure that the country works, or you won't see your family again. It's a country that is not working in any sort of way that we on the outside would describe as being functional or healthy.
And yet there's very little talk, Gary, about the West doing anything about this. People are war weary after the last 2 decades. What do you think Taliban rule in the country means for the rest of us listening in the UK?
Well, I mean, if you just go back to what we said about the health of the country generally, the World Food Programme has got stats that says 3.2 million children under 5 years are suffering from acute malnutrition. So that this is what's playing out of this economy, stagnating. This is how it's affecting real lives on the ground. People are struggling to eat. 2.8 million people are facing severe food insecurity, according to the World Food Programme. This is really hitting people on the ground, be it economically, but also actually the very basics of their lives of living a healthy life.
Yeah, although to return, Rebecca, to and what does that mean for people in the UK? I mean, actually, if the Taliban position remains not exporting terrorism globally, it seems like other actors around the world seem content to just let them get on with it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it from a sort of cold, hard, like realpolitik perspective, if you're a Western government, the Taliban has cracked down significantly on terror. The country is completely flooded with Taliban fighters, even at the village level, and there are checkpoints on roads. They have instituted a large security infrastructure, even though, as I mentioned, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State do remain a big problem. And, as we've mentioned, they've showed very little appetite to strike any blows on the world stage. They seem, for the time being anyway, happy to concentrate on projecting their power inwards and control over Afghanistan Afghanistan rather than trying to get out on the world stage and impose anything else over the borders. So when they've essentially neutered Afghanistan as a threat, this is when you see that actually the West, for all it says, is less concerned about the human rights situation. I think the important thing is that the humanitarian assistance keeps flowing in. The risk is always that something will happen in Afghanistan, something will happen with the Taliban government that will prompt the US to reduce its aid, and the US's allies as well, potentially. And that would be a huge blow. At the moment, over half the population rely on humanitarian assistance. 52% of them are children. So I think what we can be doing in the West is to try and broadly remain in support of those humanitarian programs. For all the problems that there are with them, they really are keeping millions of people alive.
Okay. Up next, is Britain's energy security about to be solved by the deployment of one massive extension lead? That's up this. Okay, Gary, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Can a new electricity superhighway put the brakes on high energy bills?
Push towards renewables has been well underway in Scotland for some time, but the new UK government has promised to make the country a clean energy superpower by the end of the decade. Projects like this one will help to achieve that, but it's also in the longer term about reducing our reliance on the international oil and gas markets.
Stephen Brown reporting for STV News from an offshore wind farm. Gary, what's the story?
Yeah, so this week, energy regulator Ofgem has given the go-ahead to the biggest electricity grid investment in British history. So it's a really key milestone. They've given this approval in 5 months. Normally things would take a lot longer than that. And this electricity superhighway, which is called Eastern Green 2, will carry renewable energy through undersea cables for 300 miles from the northeast of Scotland all the way to the north of England at a cost of a staggering £4.3 billion.
And what do we get for that 4.3 billion?
Well, according to Ofgem, the key plans are, it's vital to upgrade the energy system, allow more renewable energy to be built onto the grid. So it's essentially, at the moment, that pipeline should be able to service 2 million homes. So it's all about improving the infrastructure, allowing a national electricity grid that moves electricity from where it's produced, which is generally off the coast of Scotland, all the way to the more densely populated areas where it's consumed. The key aim is actually, let's be less reliant on sort of global gas prices and actually a lot more of this have under our own control and use more renewables that we're producing anyway.
Okay. But Emma, if it's being produced in Scotland anyway, don't they sell it to the UK first anyway? Is that not the situation?
I think that's the idea in theory, but basically Scotland is currently a net exporter of energy because there's not enough infrastructure in the UK currently for all the energy that's produced in Scotland through wind farms and the like to actually be maintained here. So what this infrastructure will help allow is for that energy to maintain within the UK, which is a huge net benefit for consumers here in the UK. It'll allow, more homegrown energy, which, should be cheaper rather than relying on volatile external markets. The creation of the transmission project should allow for, new jobs created. It's something which in its project sort of planning stage at the moment looks like being very much a net benefit.
I wonder, Rebecca, whether this is a gift to the SNP. Because it just demonstrates, doesn't it, that England depends upon Scotland when we switch to wind power?
Well, I mean, we do in a large sense. Scotland's wind farms account for 39% of all UK wind power. Is it a victory for the SNP? I mean, it's not really there to their credit that Scotland gets a lot of wind. I think what it does show, and certainly what the government in Westminster will be looking to take from this, is that what the need is for greater cooperation between Scotland and England. Because also the main issue for Scotland is that they generate a lot of energy, but they have obviously a much less dense population, and the population is very spread out. And I think most of us who aren't, particularly up to speed with the energy industry, kind of just assume that when there's surplus energy, it's just kind of being stored somewhere and then they'll just send it to wherever needs it. But the infrastructure to do that really isn't there. And that's what all of these projects that Ofgem have been approving are about. They're all about not only increasing the infrastructure to transfer energy, but also to store energy. That requires an awful lot of infrastructure.
And cooperation. I mean, actually, to return to my question, maybe this is a curse for Scottish independence because it shows that you need cooperation between the two nations. You couldn't do an infrastructure project like this if Scotland was independent.
Yeah, although there is a really interesting one that I was looking at earlier, which is that Earlier this year, the National Grid launched Viking Link. This is a 475-mile-long undersea cable, the longest in the world, connecting the British and Danish energy grids.
I'm glad you said Denmark. I'm glad that one of these titles makes sense. Viking.
Yeah, Viking Link. They were like, who are we going to name it after, your side or ours? And we were obviously just like, let's do it after yours. It's much cooler. But this means that the two nations can draw on one another's surplus renewable energy in moments where their own grids may be running short. Obviously, one of the sort of downsides of renewable energy is that unless you have lots of surplus storage capacity, there's going to be days where the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, etc. And that can have a knock-on effect. And then obviously that prompts us to fall back on fossil fuels, which is what we're trying to do less of. So this connection between Britain and Denmark, it doesn't mean that Britain or Denmark are going to lose their independence to one another anytime soon. So it is completely divorced from the political sphere in that sense. But it does have a huge benefit from an economic standpoint. It's supposed to generate £500 million of savings for UK households over the next 10 years. But I guess we will see.
Yes, well, let's talk about that, Gary. You know, as the deputy editor of Money Saving Expert, how are we going to be saving money from this in the short term? Because those savings that Rebecca's talking about, presumably, they're some years away.
Yeah, obviously, the environmental benefits of having more renewables is good, but actually, what does it mean for our bills? Well, over the last few years, we've been really reliant on global gas prices. So, for instance, after COVID, all of a sudden demand started to increase. Factories all returned to work, wholesale prices started to go up. Then when Russia invaded Ukraine, again, that played out into wholesale costs, which ultimately were passed on into bills. And that's why we've seen those staggeringly high prices recently. So, so this pipeline, the idea being is actually, we can cut out that, and actually a lot of that renewables that we're generating anyway, we can use ourselves. The crazy thing is actually at the moment we are paying some of these generators to turn off just because they're creating the energy, but we can't take it onto the grid because it was at certain times because it's going to be overloaded. When you see people struggling to heat their homes because they're worrying about how much the energy prices are, the fact that we're paying to not generate energy just seems absolutely outrageous. So anything that can go towards that, I think is welcome.
But what else can go towards it? What else can or is happening now to protect our energy security and bring Britain's bills down?
So if we look short term, obviously, what everybody's paying on their bills, everybody's generally at the moment, most people are on the energy price cap. This is those who, if you haven't switched in the last year or so, you're going to be on the energy price cap. And we're getting a new level of that from next Friday. At the moment, the price cap is set at £1,568 a year for a typical household. So that's someone who uses a typical amount of use. But under the price cap, the rates are capped. Now, on Friday, the Ofgem's going to tell us what the price cap will be for the 1st of October till the 31st of December. Now, experts at Cornwall Insight and EDF are both telling us that to expect a rise, unfortunately, of about 10%. Now, we obviously, coming into a high-use winter period, a 10% rise on the horizon energy bills is not great, particularly when, according to National Deadline, 6 million people are already struggling to pay their bills. And National Energy Action are telling us 5 million people are in fuel poverty. So, over the short term, unfortunately, if we're looking ahead to when that price cap changes again, we are going to see bills rise steeply again, I'm afraid.
So what's your advice for people then? Should they be switching now? Because for years on your website, you've basically now been saying, don't bother switching at the moment. We've built this entire platform so people can look around and see what's cheaper, and nothing's cheaper.
Yeah, you're right. For many years, previously it was really easy to save on your energy bills, wasn't it? Pop on a comparison site, spend 2 minutes, you're going to save hundreds of pounds a year on your bills. Dead simple. Unfortunately, since the energy crisis hit a couple of years ago, that's not been the case. All the deals were removed. We are seeing deals back on the market now, but it's not quite as straightforward as it used to be. You need to understand now the price cap changes every 3 months. So when you're looking at a year's fix, you kind of have to understand what's likely to happen to energy bills over the course of that year. Now, as I said just now, 10% rise, that's predicted to come in from October. The analysts are saying after that, it will stay at that level for the next year. So based on those predictions, there is no crystal ball with this, but we think if you find a fix for up to 9% more than the current price cap, that's probably worth considering. This all comes down to if you're somebody that really values that price certainty. If you don't want to ride out these volatility of the global gas markets, and actually you want to know what you're locking in your bill now is for a year, that's
yes, it may not be any cheaper, but at least you'll know what it is.
Absolutely. The risk, of course, if you fix now and prices don't rise by as much as we're expecting, you end up on a fixed deal that's potentially slightly more expensive than the price cap would have been. But it's how much you value that peace of mind. And there are fixed deals out there now around that's worth looking at. Octopus have got one, OVO have got one, British Gas have got one, E.ON also have a fixed deal, all around that mark. So, if you're somebody who is worried about that and does want to lock in a deal, that's probably worth considering. Again, no crystal ball, but for that peace of mind. So pop on a comparison site or contact those suppliers and to get that peace of mind for the next year at least.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Emma? There are so many variables, clearly. International wars and the price of oil and whether or not this sort of project gets off the ground. And yet people blame domestic politicians for this. I mean, maybe they don't. I mean, Liz Truss cut our bills, didn't she? And she didn't seem to get much thanks for that because of other things that happen with the economy. But I mean, politicians think that it makes a big difference if they intervene on this.
Yeah, I think obviously green energy is something that's has to be a major policy going into the future. And the fact is it does have an impact putting infrastructure like this in place. I mean, this project is part of the Ofgem's Accelerated Strategic Investment Framework, or ASTI, which it's 26 planned energy projects. The hope is that there will be enough energy produced through these projects to power up to, between 2 million and up to 7.5 million homes. I mean, the EGL2 expected to be completed by 2029, so it's still a little way in the future, but I think it is good that projects like this are being planned, because in the end, having renewable energy but also affordable energy is something that's such a huge factor in all our lives that it's good to see that there are some pretty major projects planned to try and bring that about.
And what about Labour's plans for GB Energy, Gary? Will that make any difference to this? Does that play into this? I mean, I know for a lot of listeners it's a bit of a nebulous concept anyway.
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen, if I'm honest with you. This is all towards a step towards net zero electricity system by 2030. So it all does feed into that, getting more renewables, So I think that is a step forward. It's going to be a lot better having control of it, within the British Isles, and rather than what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and all of a sudden worrying about pipelines out there. At least it's a little bit more within within our gift, and we have a little bit more control, and we're not wasting that renewable. We're not wasting all of that lovely wind that Scotland's producing. We are making the most of it and helping it heat our homes.
Okay. It's gloves off with Emma. We're talking Olympic boxing and not the controversy you think after this. Okay, Emma, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, the judgment on boxing at the Olympics got even more damning.
I think it's been terrible. I think, with boxing on the cusp of being thrown out of the Olympics, the decisions in this games is probably a nail in the coffin for it. And I think it's kind of done purposely in a sense that let's get rid of boxing from the games. And, it has been embarrassing. Some of the decisions have been absolutely terrible, especially towards French fighters getting the decisions. It's been real bad.
Olympic boxing bronze medalist Michael Conlon speaking to TalkSport on Friday. Emma, what's happened this week?
So, a report in the Times this week revealed that two boxing judges who are judging at the Olympics, who were previously deemed at risk of corruption by a report, were removed from the refereeing pool midway through the 2024 Games.
So hold on, so they were there and they judged on boxing matches at the Olympic Games and then they were quietly dropped?
Yes, so two judges from Kazakhstan, and forgive my pronunciation here, Alisher Altayev and Yermek Suyenish. They were dropped on August the 4th from the Paris Games, so before the medal matches, but having officiated more than 50 fights in Paris before they were dropped over concerns about whether or not they were fair or not.
What concerns?
So they were deemed at risk of corruption in a report by Professor Richard McLaren, who's a well-known figure in the Olympic movement, involved in exposing corruption in sport, including in Russia. His Protect Sport tool, and he worked with the former boxing governing body IBA, and it used things like background research, in-person interviews to determine boxing judges who were at risk of corruption, so at risk of being influenced in their decisions. Both Altayev and Suyenish were deemed risk of corruption. Altaev was high risk of corruption, but they were both allowed to judge at the Olympics and before being quietly dropped.
So, Rebecca, this story, although I said, it's not the controversy that everyone's been talking about with Olympic boxing, the gender eligibility story, it is actually related because it does come down to the same brass tacks, which is the IBA wasn't supervising boxing in the Olympics because they themselves were taken away as the regulatory body. And so you have this issue of kind of who's making decisions and who's in control.
Yeah, I think kind of the part of the row, the sort of gender row that we saw at this Olympics that gets overlooked is that the IBA were the ones who said that both of those boxers failed gender tests, but the IBA is not the governing body for Olympic boxing, and it hasn't been since 2019 when the IOC suspended it and then they expelled it in 2023 over issues with corruption and finance. And since then, Olympic boxing has been regulated, governed by an IOC-run kind of dedicated task force. One of the interesting things about Professor Richard McLaren is that he not only is a member of the International Court of Arbitration for Sport, and as Emma alluded to, he was the lead author of the McLaren report, which exposed that Russian doping in 2016, but also he was subsequently hired in 2021 as a consultant head of integrity for the IBA, part of sort of a public cleanup campaign. And that is how he came to be in the position to be flagging these Olympic boxing judges as a potential risk.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about how his program works, Protect Sport, because that in itself is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't a lot of public details about exactly how it works. It's a software that's been developed by a company. I can't remember what the name is now, but it's been developed by this outside company. And so parts of the risk assessment process are very traditional. Obviously, they conduct a lot of background research, vet the potential officials, and they do this for athletes as well. They also use this to kind of uncover doping risk in athletes. And then they conduct face-to-face interviews, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, then they use this platform called Protect Sport, which is kind of like a verbal lie detector test. It analyzes the person's voice when you ask them questions like,
would you like $100,000 in this envelope?
Literally, they ask them questions about whether it's doping or whether it's corruption. They ask them questions and then they analyze the voice because apparently vocal patterns associated with deception are the same across languages. So there shouldn't theoretically be any cultural reason why, truth and falsehood should be mixed up. And McLaren says that it has a 97% success rate, but I'm not quite sure how you would prove whether or not it had a success rate, because if you flag someone at being high risk and then you don't let them judge or compete, then how will you know if you were right? I don't want to say it's fishy because he seems like a really good figure within the movement. It seems
as reliable as any trust-based software could be to work out whether someone is susceptible
yes, that's exactly
to bribery.
how I would define it, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the thing though, isn't it, Gary? The whole thing's very subjective and reliant on individuals, and maybe you can't judge universally how a judge can behave. I mean, we saw this at other Olympic sports too. Ultimately, people make decisions. Referees make decisions across sports, and people can disagree with them. It doesn't necessarily mean they're taking a bribe or they're corrupt.
Absolutely, and part of it is why we love sport, isn't it? It gives us those talking points. Who thought, in the Premier League, for instance, bring VAR in. People say, what will we have to talk about in the pub? Everything's going to be spot on now. I don't know about you, but I think there's been more talking points since VAR came in, actually. So it certainly gives us that talking point, and how do we ever get to the make it perfect? I'm not sure. Not when there's humans. No human is perfect. But what is interesting, we're talking about the Olympics, but actually in the Euro 2024, England's semi-final referee there, he'd actually previously been banned for taking a €300 bribe. And he was obviously given a second chance to give him a very prominent match. So, it's not just boxing, it's not just the Olympics, you look across all of the sports. And, I thought that was particularly interesting that, giving such a high profile match, bearing in mind what his history was.
Yeah, I was watching the clay shooting, Emma. When you randomly just end up watching an Olympic sport because there's a Brit in it. And there was that controversial decision, wasn't there? I can't remember her name.
Amber Rutter.
But our lady got the silver medal when everyone watching, the audience, the commentators and the athletes seemed to think that she probably got the gold.
Yes. So this was, as I say, Amber Rutter, who was denied gold for GB in the skeet shooting because the way that they do it at the Olympics is that it's the judges on the at the venue who do it by eyesight. They determine whether or not a skeet has been shot or not. They do have video replays in some events, but not at the Olympics.
But everyone watching at home gets to see the replay.
Yes.
Gets to see the thing the judges can't see.
Exactly. Rutter shot the target she was determined to have missed. and then video replays show that she'd caught the target, and because of the missing out that, she missed out on gold, and it's that's an ongoing story this week as well. She's demanded an apology from basically everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of it. There's skateboarding, obviously breakdancing. Lots of people talking about that this week, aren't there? But why do you pick out boxing as the story that's worthy of our attention? Is boxing more at risk of being scrapped from the games?
Yes. So because of the situation around the IBA being stripped as the governing body of boxing, because of a history of corruption, doping, ties to the Kremlin, stuff like that, the IOC ended up running boxing at the 2024 games, and the IOC basically don't want to do that again in the Los Angeles games in 2028. So they are looking for a new governing body for boxing, which is incredibly difficult to do because the IBA still has is still claiming that it's the legitimate governing body. The IOC are looking at potentially a new body, World Boxing, but that's not been supported by everyone. So there's a very good chance that unless this whole mess is sorted out, boxing will be dropped from the games in 2028, which would be a pretty seismic move.
Yeah, it would be, Rebecca, because, obviously there are lots of people listening to this do not like boxing, think that it's, quite appropriate that a sport that is basically two people hitting each other in the head when we're trying to minimise head injuries should be taken out of the Olympics. But nonetheless, it's one of the original games, isn't it? It's been around in the Olympics for a long time. It's a classic.
Yes, it is indeed a classic. And I think there certainly would be a lot of motivation within the world of boxing to get this straightened out. The problem is that it's kind of turned into a bit of a Cold War situation because, as Emma alluded to, the IBA has a lot of connections with Russia since 2021. Umar Kreblev has been the president. He is Russian, but it's not just a nationality thing. He's also a friend of Vladimir Putin. The federation's technically headquartered in Lausanne in Switzerland, but it has moved offices to Russia. Its biggest backers, supporters in these very public rows are Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Cuba, etc. Very sort of anti-Western aligned countries. And World Boxing, that alternative federation that Emma mentioned, is largely been backed by British and US federation. So really it is a very, very political standoff, and one that neither side is likely to want to compromise on. I mean, there could be an answer, though, in the form of AI judging. The broadcaster TNT Sports has already adopted an AID judging system called Deep Strike, which uses multiple cameras, and it can measure everything from the amount of punches landed to where they land to the amount of force behind each punch. And that has been sort of touted as a potential future, although I think it would be a little bit of, the IOC is fairly conservative. I don't think that's on the horizon anytime soon, but certainly something that could eliminate theoretically human bias.
And Gary, are there other sports for the chopping block for LA 28?
Yeah, how many of us enjoyed breakdancing in this Olympics, for the
100?
Yes. And obviously, Reagan, the Australian, I don't know who saw that, the infamous kangaroo dance, which scored her a grand total of 0 points. And that will not be seen again. That one is one that's been canned for LA in 4 years' time. But if you look at the sports that are coming in at LA, it's no surprise to see some sort of sports that are particularly popular in America that are getting looking like they're going to be getting the green light. Flag football, for instance, that is a version of American football. It's not the tackling, but there's sort of flags involved in that. So baseball and softball is another one, lacrosse and squash. And not for the Americans, but probably one that we could do quite well in cricket as well.
And Emma, I know you're off to the Paralympics in Paris very soon.
Yes.
Is any of this going to impact that? Because obviously that's a lot closer than LA.
No, boxing is not a sport in the Paralympics. So fortunately, I won't be having to deal with the IBA and any of their really chaotic press conferences in Paris.
But will we see some of the same issues, do you think, around, I guess, the subjectivity of judging around the Paralympics?
Potentially. I mean, the Paralympics has issues all of its own around things like classification, basically based on disabilities. For example, if someone has cerebral palsy, depending on the range of movement that they have, they might go into a different category with, if they have more movement, put in one category, if less volume, put in another. And obviously that's such a subjective thing that people get some athletes get moved around from category to category, and it's like, you're having an independent arbiter deciding almost how disabled you are. And it's an ongoing issue. It's a really tricky, touchy subject. It's a real difficulty to cover as a journalist, because you've got to sort of work out exactly what all the categories are. And
yeah, you've got to learn all about disability as well as already having your expertise in sport. What's the thing you're most looking forward to? Let's end on that, because that's fun.
So I'm looking forward to seeing lots of British medals, seeing some great Paralympians, particularly like Dame Sarah Storey, who's won 16 Paralympic medals since first competing in 1992. She's going for another one in the road cycling. And from a personal level, I'm looking forward to going to the equestrian, partly because it's dressage and I love a bit of dressage, and also because it's being hosted at the Palace of Versailles, so it's possibly the most idyllic of Olympic venues. So I can't wait.
Great. It was good of you as well to volunteer to jump into the stadium from the roof and then ride off on a motorcycle. I'm looking forward to watching that. My thanks to Emma, to Rebecca and to Gary. That's it from us this week. No grand finale for us. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.